Retired U.S. Navy Rear Admiral Mark Montgomery is, without exaggeration, a legendary figure. Montgomery previously served on the White House National Security Council as director of the Center for Transnational Threats and led the Strategic Division in the Office of the Chief of Naval Operations. At NATO Strategic Command, he was responsible for integrating new partner nations into the alliance. We spoke with Admiral Montgomery about Ukraine's prospects in its war against Russia and the country's potential path towards NATO membership. This project is produced by the To The Point Media Center. Good afternoon, Admiral Montgomery.
Good morning, sir.
You were in Ukraine not long ago and work here. What are your personal impressions? Do you believe our armed forces will be able to hold out during the summer-autumn campaign?
Thank you for asking. My takeaway is that the Ukrainian military is not going to lose. They are not going to concede significant land in a way that puts major cities at peril. On the other hand, they're going to have a lot of trouble removing the Russian threat from eastern Ukraine and Crimea. What is a variable is how many civilian casualties occur and how much critical infrastructure is damaged, and how many military forces are lost. That is a variable. That is a variable driven by how much weapons the United States provides and Europe provide Ukraine. So that is where the risk is, that we could have more casualties, particularly civilian casualties, and more damage to critical infrastructure.
Next question. We know that America has promised to provide weapons to Ukraine under a mechanism where the US supplies the arms and Europe covers the cost. Can this approach be effective given that some European countries have already said they won't pay for these weapons?
So I think it will be very helpful. And I find it funny that the European countries are speaking about how they will have $1 trillion to rebuild a European defense industrial base over the next decade. But they cannot spend $10 billion now to help Ukraine. And they will help. They will buy the weapons, that they will provide the weapons to Ukraine and be backfilled. So I believe this $10 billion will help. But I have to tell you, there are other weapon systems that were not discussed that must be provided to Ukraine. Let me say there's two types of weapon systems that still need to be provided. There's one very good defensive system. It is called Advanced Persistent Kill Weapon System, APKWS. It is fired from the ground or from F-16s at drones. It is a great low-cost method of shooting down a Shahed drone or sometimes cruise missile. And the second weapon system is the United States needs to provide more ATACMS, long-range fires, 300-kilometer weapon system to place Russian forces at risk. If those two weapon systems were made available to Ukraine, then I really think this would be a fantastic weapons package.
What will determine whether we can actually receive this assistance?
Two things. One, President Trump needs to want to provide the strike weapons in the case of the ATACMS. And two, the U.S. Air Force will have to give up the counter-drone rockets when they would like to keep them. So these are two harder things, but I think they're both doable over the next 3 months.
There are two categories of weapons. Do you believe the United States or the broader international community could provide that would fundamentally shift the course of the war?
Certainly. I believe, look, there's three things we have to do to put pressure back on Putin. Number one, provide the defensive system so that his strikes have less effect on Ukrainian people and critical infrastructure. Two, give Ukraine the offensive weapon systems to hold Russian forces and logistics at risk hundreds of miles away from the front line. And three, improved sanctions on the Russian ability to distribute fossil fuels, oil and natural gas via the shadow fleet. If all three lines of effort are pushed, then Putin will be in a weakened position.
Admiral Montgomery, you served at NATO Strategic Command and were directly involved in the integration of new partner countries. So you are among the few who can realistically assess the situation. Does Ukraine have any genuine chance of becoming a NATO member?
So there's two aspects. What is the political aspect, the permission of the existing states to join, and that is still, there will be trouble with President Trump, but also with Slovakia and potentially Turkey. We'll have to see. But the second one is the Ukrainian military ready to join? Always the hardest thing was a former Soviet SSR, Soviet Socialist Republic, or Warsaw Pact country, had they developed the U.S. warfighting skills? Ukrainian army, yes, 100%. The hardest thing is done. The problem is there are many smaller things the Ukrainian military will have to do. New legal system that is anchored in a Western military judicial, not Soviet military judicial. New personnel system, recruiting system, education and training systems, logistics systems, procurement systems. Those must all be improved, reformed, modernized, and that will take years, not months, for each of them. So it is my thought that Ukraine should slowly start, even while fighting a war, should begin that reform of all the basic elements of the armed forces. So when someone says, yes, politically we're ready, Ukraine will say, yes, militarily we're ready. So it's a very hard question because, as you know, Ukraine's army is in the middle of the most challenging war any army has had since World War II. So the fact that they're doing any reform while fighting a large-scale Russian illegal invasion is impressive. That the Ukrainian armed forces is doing any reform, and they are. But it is years, not months, to get to be ready, and they have to continue to press along. And I know that's difficult, but you want Ukraine to be ready to go when NATO says we're ready to receive. Many former Soviet republics took 5 to 7 to 9 years once they started. Ukraine we need to make it 1 year, 2 years maximum to get everything ready. And so,
Admiral, would NATO membership be a panacea for Ukraine, essentially a safeguard that Russia would never attack us again?
I believe, look, to get to NATO membership, Putin will have had to back off, which I think you know Vladimir Putin as well as I do. That means he has lost significant credibility in Russia. So that's a whole new world to think about. But once Ukraine has NATO membership, it is a significant deterrent to future Russian action. So it must remain a long-term goal. The one good thing is reforming the military to be ready for NATO makes the Ukrainian armed forces stronger, makes Ukrainian national security stronger. So even the trip to NATO membership makes Ukraine more secure. And then, of course, NATO membership would be the final step.
Could you very simply explain why Russia is so categorically opposed to Ukraine joining NATO? Russia propaganda claims that NATO wants to attack and destroy Russia, but we know that's nonsense.
So first, NATO, an organization of 32 democracies, could never organize itself for an offensive combat operation. So I think that's a false claim. But NATO represents the end of Putin's vision of a restored Russian empire and a restored greater Russia. So, and Ukraine is the largest, closest problem, even more so than Georgia or the Baltic states. Ukraine, the independence of Ukraine is a dagger in the heart of Putin's vision of a greater Russia. And therefore, he will fight this till the end.
You know, the most common question soldiers get asked in Ukraine, especially when they return home and speak to their mother, is, when will the war end? What are your predictions? The way, at least during my next visit to my own mother, I can point out to your words, the words of someone who is without a doubt a major figure in the field of defense.
Be careful relying on me. If you'd asked me in late February of 2022 if Russia would cut through the Ukrainian army, I would have said yes, and I would have been wrong. So be careful. My thought process, I lived in the Soviet Union in Moscow in 1981, 82, during the Afghan War. And I saw Soviet resilience break because of the casualties to children from west of the Urals, St. Petersburg, Moscow, be killed. And the mothers and the babushkas very unhappy with Andropov and Chernyenko. So I think this war does not stop until Putin's base, the people who support him, the 60% that solidly support him, until they are unhappy with the war. And that is where the sanctions come in, to remove the money, the payments from the base. So it will not stop until Putin views regime credibility, his survival as the leader of Russia, at risk.
Thank you very much for agreeing to this interview, for taking the time to meet with us. Have a nice day. It was our conversation with retired U.S. Navy Rear Admiral Mark Montgomery on Ukraine's prospects in the war against Russia and its potential NATO membership. Stay safe.